Good evening. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's symposium, A Journey to South Africa. We have gathered here to celebrate and learn about the work done during a very important research project on the impact of vanadium mining in South Africa, specifically in a small mining town north of Johannesburg called Brits. 4 students, all of whom are members of the Barnard class of 2005, along with 2 faculty members, Diane Dittrich of the Environmental Science Department and Tim Halpin-Healy of Physics and Astronomy, formed the Barnard delegation. They were joined by Barnard alumna Marsha Coleman-Adebayo, representing the United States, and Jacob Ngakane of South Africa. Their research trip, which took place in July of 2003, was generously supported by the Barnard Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship Program of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and also of the GE Foundation. We are most grateful for their commitment to serious scholarship performed in the public interest. As part of the trip, the delegation attended the 2-day USA Environmental Justice Collaboration Conference held just outside of Johannesburg. The bulk of the project involved taking an overall look at hazardous mining conditions at Vametco, one of the 3 largest vanadium mining companies in South Africa. You will be hearing much more about their experience and findings shortly. An original research project of this magnitude and significance requires the hard work and commitment of many. The initial idea was put forward by Marsha Coleman-Adebayo. She presented the idea to Associate Dean of Studies, Vivian Taylor, who helped pull together the funding and the Barnard team. Professor Halpin-Healy made a vital contribution as both mentor and participant, and the assistance of Jacob Ngakane, former Congress of South African Trade Unions organizer, was invaluable. So I think we should thank all of them. Special thanks must go to Diane Dittrich. Following the trip, Diane has made a dedicated commitment to continue the mentorship of the students throughout the year. She then took the initiative to create and produce this impressive symposium, as well as the accompanying multimedia exhibition on display in the atrium and in this auditorium. And I hope, if you haven't already, you will take the time to view the exhibition, which includes a video entitled "Failure is Not an Option: The Plight of Vanadium Mine Workers in South Africa." Before we begin, I'd also like to acknowledge several special guests who are either here today or could not join us today. I understand that Lydia English, director of the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship Program of the Mellon Foundation, cannot be with us, but I believe Carmen Van Allen, also from MMUF, is she here? And members of the GE Foundation? If you are here, we thank you. If you are not here, we still thank you. And now let me turn the podium over to Professor Halpin-Healy.
Please, everybody come in and grab a seat. It's probably the best time to make yourselves comfortable. I'd just like to follow up on Judith's very warm welcome. I'm glad that everybody was able to come here tonight. And just to sort of sketch out the evening's activities, I'll be introducing Marsha Coleman-Adebayo, and she'll be telling us about her work and the No Fear Coalition and No Fear Institute and the various organizations, dedicated to supporting justice in the workplace in which she's been involved at the EPA and her work in Africa. She is a Barnard alum, and it was wonderful to be on the trip with her, with the younger Barnard students. So we're very grateful that Marsha can actually be here tonight and be representing her alma mater and tell us about her work in these various areas. After Marsha, we'll have a short word from Jocelyn Barnes, a screenwriter who works with Danny Glover, who unfortunately wasn't able to come tonight, but Jocelyn will be here in his stead. And then the center point of the evening, the students, our 4 Barnard students will be telling us about their experiences on the trip to South Africa. And then finally, Jacob Ngakane, will be finishing the festivities, and then we'll move on to the atrium for the food and music. So maybe without much further ado, I'll pass over the mic to Marsha Coleman-Adebayo. Thank you.
I must start my presentation off by just saying that I really, really thank God for this day, because I have been praying for about 5 years for this day to come. And I am literally overjoyed that it is finally here, because it is time to tell the truth about what is going on in Brits, South Africa. But first, I would like to thank President Judith Shapiro for her leadership and her commitment to the vision and to the mission of Barnard, for encouraging students to venture beyond the walls of academia and to use their skills to change the world, one community at a time. I would also like to thank Tim for just the incredible experience of traveling with you. It was wonderful. You know, oftentimes when my husband's a scientist, so I feel free to say this. Oftentimes scientists find it a bit difficult to relate to reality. But that was not the case with Tim. In South Africa, he was so committed to the people of South Africa and the struggle for justice. And you could see Tim merging these two commitments of the science and the commitment to fighting for justice. So thank you so much, Tim. Also, I'd like to thank Dean Rosalind Rosenberg, because there are a lot of people without whom this trip just simply could not have taken place. So thank you very much. Also, the students, Alexandra, Haley, Alexandria, and Kenra. All these women are so brilliant, and you're going to hear from them later, and so committed to placing their considerable skills at the disposal of communities facing difficult challenges. You know, I've been doing Africa for a long time, but I'll tell you, it was wonderful to be able to see Africa through their eyes, because it helped me look at problems in a completely different way. So I thank you so much for allowing me to see Africa again through your eyes. Special thanks also to 2 people without whom this symposium could not have occurred. First of all, Dean Vivian Taylor. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I have given so many talks about vanadium poisoning, and no one seemed to care about it, quite frankly. In fact, I remember going to the Washington Post and begging them to do a story on vanadium poisoning. And I remember this one reporter said to me, well, what's so different about Africans dying? I mean, after all, who really cares? Well, I came to Barnard and someone cared. So thank you very much, Dean Taylor. And then also, Diane Dietrich, you don't have enough flowers. We need to bathe you in flowers, because without you, in fact, when you go to the multimedia exhibit, that's all Diane's vision. That's what was in Diane's head, all the beauty of Africa, and sort of seeing it in so many different dimensions, the beautiful parts of it as well as the really sad parts of it. So thank you very much, Diane. Many of you know that the U.S. Embassy in South Africa denied Benedict Siboni a visa last Thursday. And because of the enormous efforts that were put forth through the mass media, through members of Congress, through the Barnard community, Benedict is sitting right over here today. The U.S. Embassy granted him a visa. Five hours before he had to get on the plane. But Benedict Siboni is a former vanadium worker. And so we're actually going to hear about vanadium worker through someone who actually worked in the mines in South Africa. And Jacob Ngakane, thank you so much for being here. Jacob is a freedom fighter. He was one of the members of the Liberation Front in South Africa. He went through all the things that you read about in terms of being in prison because he was fighting for freedom in South Africa. He was tortured in the prisons. He still fought for the rights of vanadium workers as a union leader, and you will also hear from Jacob Ngakane today. So thank you for being here. Well, crimes against humanity are taking place at Vametco mine in Brits, South Africa, only 1 hour from the capital of South Africa, Pretoria. Scores of people have died from vanadium poisoning, while others are chronically ill from exposure. After suffering the indignities of apartheid, vanadium miners and their families continue to pay the ultimate price. Our trip to South Africa was a life-saving mission, but not in the traditional sense of bringing doctors and medicines to a place. What we brought was hope and the promise that we would carry the message back to the United States and the global community and tell the stories of the men, women, and yes, children who are very ill or dying, anonymous deaths from vanadium poisoning. The plight of vanadium workers was brought to my attention while I served as the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency Executive Secretary of the Gore-Mbeki Commission. And I should probably stop for a second and say that I'm not representing EPA at this time, even though I still work for the agency. But that process was called the Gore-Mbeki Commission, and it was the flagship foreign policy vehicle for the United States in terms of our relationship with South Africa. And the goal of the Gore-Mbeki Commission was to provide U.S. assistance to, quote unquote, the new South African government headed by then former President Nelson Mandela. In this capacity, I organized a training program for the new environmental leadership of the country. The environmental training took place at MIT and Howard universities. During the course of the training program, I met Jacob Ngakane. At that point, he was a COSATU organizer. And from the moment he landed in Boston, Jacob talked about the plight of vanadium workers. Now, I must tell you, when he first approached me about this issue, I had no idea what he was talking about. I didn't even really know what the exposure levels were for vanadium or the impact, the health impacts. But Jacob was not daunted by that. He kept talking about vanadium workers and how, I remember once he said to me, if the United States government doesn't deal with the issue of vanadium workers, I feel that my whole trip in this country has been completely and totally a waste of my time. Well, that will get your attention, okay? If you're organizing a mission and someone says that to you, that sort of says, red flag, this is an issue that I have to deal with. But because of his advocacy and in the interest of scientific fact-finding, the Environment Committee of the Gore-Mbeki made the commitment to, quote, send an EPA team or staff member along with other independent scientists to South Africa to investigate and evaluate the health risks to the Brits community of vanadium poisoning, end quote. Tragically, the independent investigation into vanadium poisoning never occurred. In 1999, I decided later to conduct my own private investigation Jacob Ngakane and his colleagues in Kusatu hosted our delegation. I enlisted two friends who were medical doctors, Dr. Joanne Gottlieb and Dr. Carol Wyatt, to provide medical consultations during the trip. I interviewed during the first time about 20 vanadium workers and widows. The interviews were conducted in the homes of victims on the grounds of 2 vanadium mines and in a community dialogue session. Through trade union privileges, we were actually able at that time to go into a vanadium mine. Now, I must tell you that God protects fools and babies, because I had no idea what I was being exposed to when I went into the vanadium mine. But during our visit, the mine director extolled the safety of the mine and assured our group that vanadium exposure did not pose a significant health risk. However, during our meeting at the Vametco mine, courageous miners under the threat of being fired told us about inadequate health facilities. They complained about being fired as soon as health effects of vanadium became apparent. They were dismissed without health or burial insurance. Families, particularly women in the community, are left to care for the sick and dying. The miners also discussed their health problems, such as sexual dysfunction, bleeding during urination and bowel movements, as well as from the eyes and nose. All the miners stated that their tongues turn green and their eyes water. They complained of shortness of breath and experienced chest pain. The mine that we went to was completely covered in vanadium dust, and you'll hear a lot more about what a vanadium mine looks like. But approximately 40 minutes into the duration of our trip, I dropped my pencil and I bent down to pick it up, and this big glob of blood fell out of my nose. And I remember looking up and seeing these 2 smokestacks. And while I was trying to hide, I remember my girlfriend, who's a gastroenterologist, was sitting to the right of me, and I looked at her and I said, Joanne, I'm bleeding. And I remember that I so much wanted to find out what was going on in this mine. I was trying to sort of wipe my nose so that the manager wouldn't see what was going on. And when I looked up and I said to him, by the way, what are you burning? What's coming out of those smokestacks? And he said to me, in sort of a very proud way, that's almost 100% sulfuric acid. Dr. Gottlieb and I requested a bubble suit, essentially, at that point before we wanted to proceed any further in the mine. And we were told at that point that he would not give us a bubble suit because the other miners would be concerned about their health risk if they saw us in protective clothing. At that point, they escorted us, to be polite, out of the mine. Later, we visited a number of widows who shared medical reports that indicated cancer or either natural causes was the reason for their husband's death. And they recalled colleagues, family members, neighbors, and friends who they told us had all died from vanadium exposure and working at the mine. We're doing our trip last summer, thanks to the wonderful people here at Barnard. I interviewed again approximately 32 victims, along with our colleagues, but I interviewed these victims before my colleagues from Barnard arrived. And the victims in this session repeated the complaints that I had heard in 1999. Bleeding during urination, bowel movements, asthma, chronic bronchitis, skin irritation, shortness of breath, dizziness, headaches, chest pains, and cancer. They reported waking up in the morning with vanadium powder coming out of their bodies through their skin, and their white sheets, as I believe Benedict will talk about, were black. One told me, I take my morning bath and then I return to the vanadium mine. During the 2004 interview session, however, I was able to move a little bit more freely between the formal interview schedule to talk about social circumstances like family, divorce, and community relations. The interviews all revealed so many clusters, but one thing that just kept being so clear about the interviews was everyone talked about their tongues turning green and how that was the most frightening part, because at that point they knew that they were poisoned. And also in the second set of interviews, we started hearing minors talking about their tongues turning black. Victims identified themselves as, quote, depressed and waiting to die. In fact, a significant number of former minors told me that their bodies were, quote unquote, finished, and nothing is there anymore. Quote, I'm just waiting to die. All the minors discussed sexual dysfunction and related it to the disintegration of their families, leading often to adultery and divorce. One minor discussed the fact that his wife had just moved across the road to live with another man because of his sexual dysfunction. On a macro level, these men and women find themselves in an impossible situation, puns of a global system that they can neither control nor negotiate. Not only are they victims of vanadium poisoning, but they're also victims of a global economy that view their lives as a necessary sacrifice for Western industrial society. They neither reap an economic benefit from this status or the monetary acknowledgement of their contribution to the infrastructure of Western society. On a micro level, these men are sick and in many cases dying and witness the disintegration of their families and communities. Vanadium poisoning does not only contaminate the environment, it also destroys the soul. The United States is the primary beneficiary of South African vanadium. Vametco, one of the 3 largest vanadium mining companies in South Africa, is owned by an American company based in Dansbury, Connecticut, called Strategic Minerals Corporation, or Stratcor, otherwise known as the U.S. Vanadium Corporation, an outgrowth of the breakup of Union Carbide due to the Bhopal tragedy. Without South African vanadium, the quality of life that most Americans take for granted would be seriously compromised. Henry Ford once remarked that without vanadium, the American Industrial Revolution would have been impossible. Vanadium helps the steel, titanium, and chemical industries improve their products and processes. However, behind the military, industrial, daily life necessities of the Western world for vanadium lies the anonymous men and women who are forced to choose between unemployment or mining vanadium. The unemployment rate, as I understand it, is over 50% in Brits. Little attention has been paid to women exposed to vanadium pentoxide. This exposure can occur either through living with their husbands who mine vanadium and carry the deadly substance in their hair, nails, and skin. The exposure often occurs through the care and maintenance of mining uniforms. These women live in the community contiguous to the mine. The pollution permeates the soil, air, and water supply. Research on the impact of vanadium exposure on fetal child development and pregnancy is scarce. Recently, women of childbearing age, and this is really scary, have started mining vanadium. Vanadium widows are left destitute and sick. I found that the majority of the women that I interviewed also complained of upper respiratory illnesses, asthma, bronchitis, and cancer. In fact, in one interview, a widow told me that she had not eaten in 2 days, and I actually decided, usually when you're interviewing people, you don't pay them because there are all kinds of little ethical things, but she was clearly very, very hungry. And so I decided to give her some money for food. And I stopped by her house. It was an unscheduled visit one day, and I just stopped by to say hi to her. And she asked me for some more money for food. And I asked her, why? Didn't you buy food with the money I gave you? I think it was yesterday, a day before yesterday. And she told me no, she didn't. That instead of buying food, she had decided to pay her rent. And when I asked her, why would you pay your rent when you're so hungry? She looked at me as though, you don't really get it, do you, lady? And she said to me, you know, I'd rather be hungry than homeless. That's what it's like. That sort of gives you an interesting picture of what this community is like. All work has dignity, and the rights of workers cannot coincide with an accident of birth. The lives and deaths of vanadium workers must become a part of the American consciousness, particularly since our quality of life is so dependent on their sacrifice. Peace is not simply the absence of war. In its most organic state, it is the presence of justice. I hope this symposium will explore the question of next steps and how the Barnard community can bring hope to a community that has been abandoned. The Vameco community is relatively small, less than 2,000 people, which means that we have an opportunity to really make a difference in our own small way, change the world, one community at a time. Thank you.